The lawyer's pen scratched against the paper as he slid the deed across his mahogany desk. My hands trembled as I reached for it. 17 years old and suddenly the owner of 700 acres I'd never seen. Ruth Campbell's signature stared back at me from the bottom of the will. A woman whose name I'd never heard until 3 days ago, when this same lawyer called the group home where I'd spent the last 4 years of my life. 700 acres. The words felt impossible in my mouth. I'd grown up sharing bedrooms with 3 other girls, owning nothing but a duffel bag of secondhand clothes and a worn teddy bear I'd hidden under my mattress since I was 12. Now Gregory Lee, this soft-spoken attorney with kind eyes, was telling me I owned more land than I could even imagine. The inheritance came with a letter. Ruth Campbell had written it 6 months before she died, her handwriting shaky but determined. She'd found me through a private investigator after years of searching. My mother, she wrote, had been her daughter, the daughter she'd disowned 20 years ago for falling in love with the wrong man. The daughter who died in a car accident when I was 2, leaving me with no known relatives and a one-way ticket into the foster system. I am dying, the letter read, and I cannot take back the words I said or the years I lost. But I can give you what should have been yours all along. Come home. Home. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd never had a home, not really. Group homes and foster families, yes, but never a place that belonged to me. Never somewhere I could stay forever if I wanted to. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take turns you won't believe. The bus ride from Chicago to Cedar Falls, Montana took 14 hours. I pressed my face against the window and watched the city fade into suburbs, then farmland, then mountains. My caseworker, Sandra Scott, had driven me to the station herself, something she'd never done before. She'd handed me an envelope with $500 cash and her business card. "You don't have to do this," she'd said. "We can find you another placement until you age out." But I could see in her eyes that she thought I should go. Maybe she was tired of trying to find families who wanted a 17-year-old with trust issues and a habit of running away when things got hard. The bus pulled into Cedar Falls at 6 in the morning. Population 3,000, according to the faded welcome sign. Main Street stretched for exactly 4 blocks, lined with brick buildings that looked like they hadn't changed since 1950. A diner called Millie's sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering in the early dawn light. Across the street, a feed store advertised hay bales and farm equipment in hand-painted letters on the window. Gregory Lee picked me up in a dusty pickup truck that smelled like coffee and leather. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with calloused hands that suggested he did more than push papers for a living. "The ranch is about 10 miles out," he said as we drove through town. "Ruth left everything to you. The house, the land, the livestock. There's also a trust fund to cover property taxes and basic maintenance for the next 5 years. After that, well, you'll need to figure out how to make it work." I stared out the window at the rolling hills covered in golden grass. Cattle dotted the landscape like scattered toys. I'd never seen so much open space in my life. In the group home, I could touch both walls of my bedroom if I stretched my arms out wide. "What am I supposed to do with 700 acres, I asked. Gregory glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Ruth raised cattle. Good money in it, if you know what you're doing. She also had some of the best grazing land in the county. You could lease it out if you don't want to ranch yourself. The house appeared around a bend in the gravel road like something from a movie. 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the morning light. A red barn sat behind it, bigger than the group home I'd just left. Corrals and outbuildings stretched in every direction, and beyond them, pastures rolled toward the mountains like a green carpet. I climbed out of the truck on shaking legs. The air smelled like grass and hay and something clean I couldn't identify. Wind, maybe. Space. Gregory handed me a set of keys. "The big ones for the front door. The smaller ones are for the barn and the outbuildings. There's a foreman's cottage about a quarter mile that way. Frank Phillips has been running the day-to-day operations. Good man, he'll help you learn the ropes if you want." He drove away, leaving me standing alone in front of the biggest house I'd ever seen. I climbed the porch steps slowly, my sneakers loud against the wood planks. The front door was solid oak with glass panels that showed glimpses of the interior. I turned the key and stepped inside. The silence hit me first, not the tense quiet of institutional living, but something waver. Peaceful. The entryway opened into a living room with stone fireplace and furniture covered in white sheets. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and dust. I pulled the sheet off the nearest chair and sank into soft leather that molded to my body. On the mantel above the fireplace, photographs in silver frames showed a life I'd never known. A young woman with dark hair, and my eyes smiled from a dozen different poses. My mother, Helen Cruz, according to the names written on the backs in careful script. There were pictures of her as a child, riding horses and feeding calves, as a teenager laughing with friends at what looked like a county fair, as a young woman in a wedding dress, standing next to a man with kind eyes and my stubborn chin. My father, I realized. The man Ruth Campbell had disapproved of enough to cut her daughter from her life. The last photo showed my mother holding a baby. Me. We were standing in front of this same fireplace, and my mother looked tired but happy. Someone had written Helen and baby on the back, along with a date from 17 years ago. I found more letters in the kitchen, tucked inside a ceramic cookie jar shaped like a cow. Ruth had written dozens of them over the years, all addressed to Helen at various foster homes and group homes around Chicago. Letters asking for forgiveness. Letters begging for a chance to meet her granddaughter. Letters that had been returned unopened, marked addressee unknown or no forwarding address. She'd been looking for me since I was 2 years old. The refrigerator held fresh groceries, milk that wouldn't expire for another week, bread that was still soft. Someone had been taking care of the place, preparing for my arrival. I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at land that belonged to me. The phone rang while I was exploring the upstairs bedrooms. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up the old rotary phone in what had been my mother's childhood room. "This is Linda Green from the county assessor's office," a woman's voice said. "I'm calling about the Campbell property. There's been some questions raised about the inheritance, and we need to schedule a meeting." "Questions," I repeated. "What kind of questions?" "Well, there's been a claim filed by Raymond Chavez. He says he's Ruth Campbell's nephew and that the will was improperly executed. He's requesting a full probate review." The sandwich I'd eaten turned to lead in my stomach. Someone was trying to take the ranch away from me. I'd been here for exactly 4 hours, and already someone wanted to prove I didn't belong. "When is the meeting?" I asked. "Tomorrow at 10, at the courthouse in Cedar Falls. You'll want to bring your attorney." I hung up and sank onto my mother's childhood bed. The room was exactly as she'd left it, Gregory had told me. Ruth had kept it like a shrine, hoping Helen would come home someday. Pink walls and white furniture, horse ribbons tacked to a bulletin board, books about veterinary medicine stacked on the nightstand. I found my mother's diary in the bottom drawer of her desk. The entries started when she was my age, full of dreams about college and veterinary school and taking over the ranch someday. Then they turned angry. Arguments with Ruth about my father, harsh words about narrow minds and old-fashioned thinking. The final entry was dated 3 days before she left home forever. "She doesn't understand that love isn't something you can control," my mother had written. "She thinks she can choose my life for me, but she's wrong. I'd rather have nothing than live the life she wants for me." I closed the diary and pressed it against my chest. My mother had given up everything for love, and I'd inherited the consequences. But I'd also inherited the things she'd walked away from. 700 acres of second chances. The next morning, I walked into the Cedar Falls courthouse wearing the only dress I owned, a black thing Sandra Scott had bought me for job interviews I'd never gone on. Gregory Lee met me in the lobby, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that made me feel slightly less terrified. Raymond Chavez was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-50s, expensive suit, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a sharp-faced woman who looked like she ate teenagers for breakfast. The judge was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes. He listened to both sides with the patience of someone who'd heard every possible variation of family drama. Raymond's attorney argued that Ruth had been mentally incompetent when she wrote the will, influenced by grief and medication. She claimed the inheritance should go to Ruth's closest living relative, which was Raymond. Gregory stood up when it was our turn. "Ruth Campbell was examined by 3 different doctors in the months before her death," he said. "All of them declared her mentally competent. She hired a private investigator to find her granddaughter and spent months planning this inheritance. She knew exactly what she was doing. He presented medical records, bank statements showing the private investigator's fees, and copies of all the letters Ruth had written over the years. The judge read through everything carefully while I sat there trying not to throw up. Finally, the judge looked up. The evidence clearly shows that Ruth Campbell was of sound mind when she executed her will. The inheritance stands as written. Case dismissed. Raymond Chavez's face turned red. This isn't over, he said as he packed his briefcase. That girl doesn't know the first thing about ranching. She'll run the place into the ground within a year. Maybe, I said, standing up straighter than I felt. But it'll be my choice to make. Frank Phillips was waiting for me when I got back to the ranch. He stood next to the barn, a man in his 60s with weathered skin and eyes the color of faded denim. He wore jeans and boots that had seen decades of hard work, and a hat that had probably been expensive once but was now shaped by weather and time. Heard you had some trouble in town, he said without preamble. Raymond's been sniffing around here for months, ever since Ruth got sick. Figured he'd make a play for the place. I walked over to where he stood, trying to project more confidence than I felt. Gregory said you've been running things here. Frank nodded. Ruth hired me 15 years ago when her arthritis got too bad for her to handle the heavy work. Good woman. Stubborn as a mule, but fair. He studied my face carefully. You look like your mother. You knew her. Course I knew her. Helen was born on this ranch, same as her mother before her. Smart girl. Had a way with animals that was something to see. Ruth never got over losing her. We walked through the barn together, Frank explaining the layout and routines. 60 head of cattle, mostly Angus with some Herefords mixed in. Spring calving, which meant the babies would start arriving in March. Hay fields that needed cutting twice a year. Fences that required constant maintenance. A dozen tasks I'd never heard of, let alone knew how to do. It's a lot to learn, Frank said, watching my face. But Ruth left detailed records of everything. Breeding schedules, vaccination records, financial statements going back 20 years. Woman was organized, I'll give her that. He showed me the books that evening, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with ledgers spread between us. The ranch made money. Not a fortune, but enough to live on if you were careful. The cattle brought in about $60,000 a year, and leasing some of the pasture land to neighboring ranchers added another $20,000. Property taxes, feed costs, veterinary bills, and Frank's salary ate up most of the profit, but there was enough left over for a modest living. The trust fund Ruth set up will cover the big expenses for 5 years, Frank explained. After that, you'll need to make it profitable on your own. You thinking about staying? I don't know, I said honestly. 3 days ago, I was sleeping in a group home. Now I own more land than I can walk across in a day. It doesn't feel real yet. Frank nodded. Ruth felt the same way when her parents died and left her this place. She was only 22, didn't know a thing about ranching. But she learned, worked 18-hour days for the first few years, made mistakes that cost her thousands of dollars. But she stuck with it. Why, I asked. Why didn't she just sell it and do something easier? Frank was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the pastures where cattle moved like dark shadows in the twilight. Because this place gets in your blood, he said finally. Ruth used to say the land chooses its people, not the other way around. Maybe it chose you. That night I lay in my mother's old bed and listened to sounds I'd never heard before. Wind through the trees, cattle lowing in the distance, the settling noises of an old house. No traffic, no sirens, no voices through thin walls. Just space and quiet and the weight of 700 acres spreading around me like a promise. I found more of my mother's things over the next few days. Riding boots in the mudroom that were exactly my size. A leather jacket hanging in the closet with her initials stitched inside the collar. Books about animal husbandry and ranch management. Margins filled with her neat handwriting. Frank started teaching me the basics. How to check the cattle for signs of illness or injury. How to fix a broken fence post. How to operate the tractor that looked like it belonged in a museum but ran like it was built yesterday. My hands blistered from work I'd never done before, and I fell into bed each night exhausted in a way that felt good instead of defeating. The people in town were harder to figure out. Some of them welcomed me with the kind of warmth I'd never experienced. Cynthia Parker, who owned the diner, insisted on feeding me lunch every time I came to town for supplies. She'd known my mother as a child and had stories about Helen's adventures that made me laugh and cry at the same time. Others were more skeptical. The feed store owner, Adam Powell, charged me full price for everything and made it clear he thought I'd be gone before winter. A few of the neighboring ranchers stopped by to introduce themselves, but I could see them calculating how long it would take for me to fail so they could buy my land. Brian Taylor was different. He owned the ranch to the east of mine, about my age with sun-bleached hair and the kind of easy smile that probably got him into trouble with girls. He showed up one morning while Frank and I were fixing a water trough, driving a truck that was somehow both beat up and well-maintained. "Heard we had a new neighbor," he said, climbing out of the truck. "I'm Brian. My family's got the spread next door." We shook hands, his calloused and confident, mine still soft despite weeks of ranch work. He had the kind of presence that filled up space without trying, comfortable in his own skin in a way I envied. "You settling in okay?" he asked. "It's a big change from city life." "How do you know I'm from the city?" I asked. Frank laughed. "Everyone knows everything about everyone around here. It's the curse of small towns." Brian grinned. "Plus you're wearing brand new work gloves and boots that don't have a single scuff mark." Dead giveaway. I looked down at my pristine gear, feeling foolish. Everything about me screamed outsider, from my unmarked clothes to my complete ignorance about ranch life. "Don't worry about it," Brian said, reading my expression. "We all started somewhere. My dad threw me on a horse when I was 5 and told me to figure it out. Took me 3 years to stop falling off. The first real test came in October, when Frank announced it was time to move the cattle to the winter pasture. This involved rounding them up from the far corners of the ranch and herding them through a series of gates to a field closer to the barn where we could keep a better eye on them during the cold months. "You ever been on a horse?" Frank asked me the night before. I shook my head. The closest I'd come to riding anything was a city bus. "Well," he said, "tomorrow's as good a day as any to learn." The horse Frank chose for me was a gentle mare named Rosie, brown with white markings that looked like someone had splashed paint on her face. She stood patiently while Frank showed me how to put on the saddle and bridle, her dark eyes watching my clumsy efforts with what I swear was amusement. "Horses can sense fear," Frank told me as I approached Rosie's left side. "But they can also sense confidence, even if you are faking it. So fake it until you make it." I climbed into the saddle with all the grace of a scarecrow, my legs shaking and my hands gripping the reins too tightly. Rosie shifted her weight, and I was sure I was about to slide off and embarrass myself in front of Frank and the 3 neighboring ranchers who'd come to help with the roundup. But Rosie was patient. She walked slowly when I asked her to walk, stopped when I pulled gently on the reins, and turned left or right when I shifted my weight in the saddle. By the time we reached the far pasture where the cattle were grazing, I was starting to feel like maybe I could do this. The roundup was controlled case. 60 head of cattle scattered across 200 acres, and our job was to convince them all to move in the same direction toward a gate that looked impossibly small from where we sat on horseback. Frank and the other ranchers rode like they were part of their horses, wheeling and cutting and shouting instructions that sounded like a foreign language. "Stay behind them," Frank called to me. "Don't let any break away to the left." I guided Rosie to where Frank had pointed, trying to look like I knew what I was doing. A group of about 15 cattle moved past me, and I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't so hard after all. Then a young bull decided he'd rather go back to the far pasture than follow the herd. He broke away from the group and headed straight for the fence line, and suddenly Frank was shouting at me to cut him off. I squeezed my legs against Rosie's sides the way Frank had taught me, and she responded by moving faster than I'd expected. We intercepted the bull just as he reached the fence, and somehow, miraculously, he turned back toward the herd. "Nice work," Brian called from across the field. "You're getting the hang of it." The compliment warmed me more than it should have. I was 17 years old and had been on a horse for exactly 2 hours. But in that moment, I felt like I belonged here. Like maybe the land really had chosen me, the way Frank said. We got all 60 head through the gate and into the winter pasture by late afternoon. The other ranchers headed home, but Brian lingered, helping Frank and me check the water troughs and make sure the fence was secure. "You did good today," he said as we unsaddled the horses. Most people take weeks to learn what you picked up in one afternoon. I have a good teacher, I said, nodding toward Frank. Brian smiled. Frank's the best there is. But you can't teach natural ability. Either you have it or you don't. That night, I called Sandra Scott from the kitchen phone, something I'd been putting off for weeks. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. "How are you doing out there?" she asked. "Really doing, not just the polite answer. I'm learning to ride horses," I said, "and fix fences, and tell the difference between healthy cattle and sick ones. It's hard work, but I like it." "You sound different," Sandra said. "Happier." I am happier, I realized as I said it. For the first time in my life, I had a place that was mine. Not temporarily, not until someone decided I was too much trouble, but mine forever if I could make it work. The winter was harder than I'd expected. Snow fell in November and didn't stop until March, piling up in drifts that reached the windows of the house. The cattle needed hay every day, and checking on them meant bundling up in layers of clothing and trudging through snow that sometimes came up to my knees. Frank taught me to drive the tractor with the hay spear attachment, and I spent hours every week loading round bales onto the trailer and distributing them around the pasture. The cattle would gather around each bale like it was a campfire, their breath steaming in the cold air. The house felt enormous during those long winter months. I moved into Ruth's bedroom on the first floor, partly because it was warmer and partly because I'd found more letters there, hidden in a shoebox under the bed. These were the letters Ruth had written but never sent. Drafts of apologies to my mother that grew more desperate with each passing year. "I know I was wrong." One letter read, "I know I hurt you with my pride and my fear of what people would think. If I could take back every word I said about your father, I would. He was a good man and you loved him, and that should have been enough for me." Another letter, written just months before Ruth died, was addressed to me. "I will never meet you, but I hope you will know that I loved your mother even when I was too stubborn to show it. I hope you will forgive an old woman's mistakes and find some happiness on this land that has been in our family for 3 generations. You are the future I threw away when I let pride come before love." I cried reading those letters, sitting in Ruth's chair by the fireplace while snow fell outside the windows. I cried for the grandmother I'd never known, for the mother I barely remembered, and for all the years we'd lost because of words that couldn't be taken back. But I also felt something else: determination. This ranch was more than land and cattle and buildings. It was a legacy, a second chance, a way to honor the family I'd never known I had. Spring arrived like a miracle. The snow melted, revealing grass that had been dormant for months, and the cattle moved restlessly in the pasture, sensing the change in the air. Frank announced it was time to prepare for calving season, which meant checking the pregnant cows twice a day and setting up the maternity pen near the barn. "Your first calving season," Frank said as we walked through the herd, identifying the cows that would deliver in the next few weeks. "It's the best and worst time of the year. New life, but also sleepless nights and emergency calls to the vet." The first calf was born on a Tuesday morning in late March. I found the cow in labor when I went out for the morning check, lying on her side in the maternity pen with her breathing heavy and labored. Frank had told me what to look for, but seeing it in person was different. The calf was breeched, coming out backwards instead of head first. Frank arrived within minutes of my call, took one look at the situation and rolled up his sleeves. "Going to need your help," he said. "Hold her head and keep her calm while I try to turn the calf." I knelt in the straw next to the cow's head, stroking her neck and murmuring the kind of nonsense words I'd heard Frank use. She was in pain, her eyes wide with fear, but she seemed to respond to the gentle touch. Frank worked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, his arm deep inside the cow as he tried to reposition the calf. Finally, he nodded. "Here it comes," he said. The calf slipped out in a rush of fluid and blood, limp and still. For a terrifying moment, I thought we'd lost it. But then Frank cleared its nose and mouth with his fingers, and suddenly it was breathing, shaking its head and trying to stand. The cow immediately began licking her baby clean, her maternal instincts taking over. Within an hour, the calf was standing on wobbly legs and nursing, and I felt like I'd witnessed something miraculous. "That's what it's all about," Frank said. washing his hands at the outdoor spigot, bringing new life into the world. Your mother loved calving season, used to sleep in the barn during the busiest weeks, just in case. Over the next month, we delivered 17 more calves. Most of them came easily, but a few required intervention. I learned to assist with difficult births, to give injections when calves were sick, to bottle feed the ones whose mothers couldn't or wouldn't nurse them. Brian stopped by regularly during calving season, sometimes to help with difficult deliveries, sometimes just to check on how I was doing. He had a way of making the hardest days seem manageable, bringing coffee and sandwiches when Frank and I had been up all night with a sick cow. "You're turning into a real rancher," he said one evening, as we watched a group of calves play in the pasture, running and jumping with the pure joy of being alive. "I don't feel like a real rancher," I admitted. "Half the time I still feel like I'm pretending." Brian laughed. "My grandfather used to say that feeling never goes away completely. Every rancher I know still has moments where they feel like they're making it up as they go along." The spring work was endless. Fences that had been damaged by winter storms needed repair. The hay fields required fertilizing and seeding. The cattle needed vaccinations and health checks. I fell into bed each night exhausted but satisfied, my hands permanently stained with dirt and my muscles aching in ways that felt good. I was learning the rhythm of ranch life, the way each season brought its own demands and rewards. But I was also learning something else, something harder to define. I was learning who I was when I wasn't defined by being unwanted, by being temporary, by being someone else's problem to solve. The first anniversary of Ruth's death came in May. I'd been on the ranch for 8 months, and it felt like a lifetime. Frank and I drove to the cemetery in town, carrying flowers from Ruth's garden that I'd learned to tend. Her headstone was simple granite with her name and dates and the words beloved mother and grandmother. Someone had left fresh flowers there recently, and I wondered if it was one of the neighbors or maybe Gregory Lee. I stood there for a long time, trying to find words for everything I wanted to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. Thank you seemed... I'm sorry felt wrong since I had nothing to apologize for. Finally, I just told her about the ranch, about the calves and the repairs, and the way the sunrise looked different every morning from her kitchen window. "She would be proud of you," Frank said as we walked back to the truck. "You've got her determination and your mother's way with animals. It's a good combination." That summer brought new challenges. A drought in July meant we had to supplement the pasture grass with expensive hay. A broken water pump cost $3,000 to replace. One of the older cows developed a respiratory infection that required daily antibiotic injections for 2 weeks. But there were victories too. The calf crop had been excellent, with healthy babies that would bring good money at the fall sale. The hayfields produced more than expected despite the dry weather. And slowly, gradually, I was gaining the respect of the other ranchers in the area. Adam Powell at the feed store started giving me the same discounts he gave longtime customers. Cynthia Parker at the diner saved me pieces of pie and asked my opinion about local issues like I was a permanent resident instead of a temporary visitor. Even Raymond Chavez, who still glared at me when our paths crossed in town, had stopped making comments about city girls who didn't belong on ranches. The biggest change was in myself. I caught my reflection in the barn window one afternoon and barely recognized the person looking back at me. My skin was tanned from hours in the sun, my hair was longer and lighter, and my hands were strong and capable. But the biggest difference was in my eyes. The wariness was still there, probably always would be, but it was tempered now by something that looked like confidence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in August, delivered by a courier who seemed surprised to find someone actually living at the remote ranch address. It was from a law firm in Denver, thick paper with embossed letterhead that suggested expensive legal representation. "Dear Miss Campbell," it began, and I had to read that line 3 times before it sank in. Campbell. Someone was calling me by Ruth's last name, the name I'd never used but apparently had a legal right to claim. The letter was from a different nephew of Ruth's, this one claiming that Raymond Chavez had been lying about his relationship to the Campbell family. According to the Denver lawyers, this new nephew, who called himself the true heir, was prepared to challenge my inheritance with documentation that proved Raymond had been a fraud. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the offer at the end of the letter. This supposed nephew was willing to drop his claim and let me keep the ranch in exchange for a one-time payment of $200,000. A bargain, the letter suggested, considering the ranch was worth well over $1 million. I showed the letter to Frank, who read it twice before shaking his head. Sounds like a scam to me, he said. These vultures come out of the woodwork whenever there's property involved. They figure you're young and scared and might pay up just to avoid a fight. But what if he's legitimate? I asked. What if he really is Ruth's nephew and has a better claim than I do? Frank looked at me steadily. You think Ruth would have left this place to you if she wasn't sure about your rights to it? That woman was careful about everything, especially legal matters. She wouldn't have risked leaving you something that could be taken away. I called Gregory Lee, who was equally skeptical about the letter. He promised to investigate the Denver law firm and the supposed nephew, but warned me it might take weeks to get answers. In the meantime, life on the ranch continued. The cattle needed daily care regardless of legal threats. The hay needed cutting before it got too mature. The fences required constant attention. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Frank. You're pushing yourself pretty hard, Brian observed one evening as he helped me repair a section of fence that had been damaged by fallen trees. The legal stuff will work itself out. I know, I said, tightening a wire with more force than necessary. I just feel like if I work hard enough, if I prove I belong here, maybe nobody will be able to take it away. Brian stopped working and looked at me. You think someone's going to take the ranch away from you? The possibility had been keeping me awake at night for weeks, not just because of the letter, but because of everything. I was 18 years old with no family, no money beyond what Ruth had left me, and no real experience with the kind of legal battles that seemed to follow inherited property. I don't know, I said finally. I've never had anything that couldn't be taken away. Foster homes, group homes, even the few good placements, they all ended eventually. I guess I'm still waiting for someone to tell me this was all a mistake. Brian set down his tools and walked over to where I stood. This isn't a foster home, he said quietly. This is your land, left to you by your grandmother, fair and square. Nobody's going to take it away from you. How can you be so sure, I asked. Because I've watched you for the past year, he said. I've seen you learn everything from horseback riding to cattle medicine. I've seen you work 18-hour days during calving season and get up the next morning ready to do it again. This place chose you, and you chose it back. That's not something anyone can undo with a piece of paper. Gregory Lee called 3 days later with news about the Denver law firm. They were legitimate lawyers, but the nephew they represented was not. The man had been using a fake name and had no connection to the Campbell family whatsoever. The whole thing had been an elaborate scam designed to extort money from inheritance beneficiaries. The FBI is investigating, Gregory told me. Apparently, they've tried this same scheme with other people in similar situations. You did the right thing by not responding to their demands. The relief I felt was overwhelming, not just because the immediate threat was gone, but because it confirmed what Frank and Brian had been telling me all along. The ranch was mine legally and completely, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that. But the experience had taught me something important about myself. I'd been so focused on proving I deserved the inheritance that I'd missed the bigger truth. I didn't have to earn the right to be here. Ruth had given it to me freely, as a gift and an apology, and a chance to build a life her daughter had never gotten to live. That night I sat on the front porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The cattle were settled for the night, the chores were done, and the ranch stretched around me like a promise kept. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt truly at home. The fall cattle season was my first real test as a ranch owner. Frank and I spent weeks preparing, sorting the calves by weight and quality, making sure their vaccinations were current, and arranging transportation to the sale barn in Great Falls. You nervous? Frank asked as we loaded the cattle trucks on sale day. Terrified, I admitted. What if I've done something wrong? What if the calves don't bring enough money to cover expenses? Frank smiled. Ruth felt the same way before her first sale. But you've done everything right. These are good calves from good mothers, and the market's strong this year. The sale barn was chaos. Hundreds of cattle from dozens of ranches, buyers walking through the pens examining animals, auctioneers calling out prices in rapid-fire voices that sounded like a foreign language. I stood next to Frank in the viewing area, watching our calves move through the ring one group at a time. The prices were better than I dared hope. Our calves averaged almost $2 per pound, which meant the 18 steers and heifers we'd brought to market would bring in nearly $30,000. After transportation costs and sale barn fees, I'd clear about $28,000, enough to cover winter feed and still have money left over for improvements. Good sale, Brian said, appearing beside me as our last group of calves sold. You should be proud. I am proud, I realized. Not just of the prices, but of the calves themselves. They were healthy and well-grown, the result of good genetics, proper nutrition, and careful management. They represented everything I'd learned about ranching in the past year. The check presentation ceremony felt surreal. Standing in front of a room full of ranchers, many of whom had been skeptical of the city girl who'd inherited the Campbell place, accepting a check that represented my first real success as a ranch owner. Ruth would be proud, Cynthia Parker said, as I walked past her table at the post-sale dinner. You've done right by her legacy. That winter was different from my first one. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the isolation and responsibility, I found myself settling into routines that felt natural. Morning chores, afternoon projects, evening bookkeeping. The rhythm of ranch life that had once seemed foreign now felt like the only way to live. I enrolled in extension courses through the state university, learning about range management and animal nutrition and business planning. The textbooks joined my mother's veterinary manuals on the kitchen table, and I spent long winter evenings studying subjects I'd never imagined caring about. Brian started coming over for dinner once a week, usually bringing steaks from his family's ranch, and staying to help with whatever project I was working on. We talked about everything and nothing, and slowly I began to understand that what was growing between us was more than friendship. The realization scared me at first. I'd never had a real relationship, never trusted anyone enough to let them get that close. But Brian was patient, content to let things develop naturally without pushing for more than I was ready to give. Spring brought the second calving season, and this time I felt confident in my abilities. When a cow had trouble delivering, I knew how to help. When a calf was born weak, I knew how to tube feed it and give it the best chance of survival. When a first-time mother rejected her baby, I knew how to convince her to accept it. Frank watched me work with obvious pride. "You don't need me anymore," he said one morning as we finished checking the maternity pen. "You've got good instincts and the knowledge to back them up." "I'll always need you," I protested. "You're the one who taught me everything." Frank shook his head. "I taught you the basics, but you've gone way beyond that. You're thinking like a rancher now, not just following instructions." He was right, I realized. Somewhere over the past 2 years, I'd stopped feeling like I was pretending to be a rancher and started actually being one. The transformation had been so gradual I hadn't noticed it happening, but now it was undeniable. The second anniversary of Ruth's death came and went with less ceremony than the first. I left flowers on her grave and spent the morning riding through the far pastures, checking fences and counting cattle, and thinking about how much had changed. The scared teenager who'd stepped off the bus in Cedar Falls was gone, replaced by a young woman who could deliver calves and fix tractors and make decisions that affected hundreds of acres and dozens of animals. More importantly, I'd learned to trust myself, to believe that I belonged here not because someone had given me permission, but because I'd earned it through hard work and dedication. That summer brought new challenges and new successes. A neighboring ranch went up for sale, and after careful consideration and consultation with Frank and Gregory Lee, I decided to buy it. The additional 300 acres would give me more grazing land and allow me to expand the herd. The bank loan process was intimidating, but my financial records were solid and my business plan was sound. The loan officer, a woman about my age who'd grown up in Cedar Falls, seemed impressed by what I'd accomplished in such a short time. "You've really made something of that place," she said as she approved the loan. "Ruth would be amazed at what you've done with it." The expansion meant more work, but also more opportunity. I hired a part-time hand to help with the additional cattle and began planning improvements that would increase the ranch's efficiency and profitability. Brian was there through all of it, offering advice when I asked for it and support when I needed it. Our relationship had deepened slowly and naturally, built on shared work and mutual respect, rather than dramatic declarations or grand gestures. One evening in late summer, as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset, he took my hand and said quietly, "I love you." The words should have terrified me, but instead they felt like coming home. I love you too, I said, and meant it completely. The proposal came 6 months later, on a cold February morning when we were checking cattle in the far pasture. Brian had been acting nervous all week, and I'd assumed he was worried about a sick cow or a broken piece of equipment. Instead, he dismounted from his horse next to a grove of cottonwood trees and pulled a small box from his coat pocket. I know this isn't the most romantic setting, he said, gesturing at the snow-covered pasture and the cattle watching us with mild interest. But this is where we met, where we fell in love, where we've built something together. He opened the box to reveal a simple diamond ring, beautiful in its understated elegance. Will you marry me, he asked. Will you let me be part of this life you've built? Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. We were married the following October, in a ceremony at the ranch with the mountains as our backdrop and our cattle as witnesses. Frank walked me down the aisle that we created between rows of chairs in the front yard. Cynthia Parker catered the reception, and Gregory Lee officiated. Sandra Scott drove out from Chicago for the wedding, amazed by the transformation she saw in me and in my life. You found where you belong, she said as we danced to music provided by a local country band. I did, I agreed. Or maybe it found me. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. Drought years when we had to sell cattle early because the grass wouldn't support them. Market crashes that cut our income in half. Equipment failures that cost thousands of dollars to repair. But there were triumphs too. Record calf crops that exceeded all expectations. Innovations in grazing management that increased our carrying capacity. Recognition from the State Cattlemen's Association for conservation practices that improved both profitability and environmental stewardship. Brian and I expanded the operation together, buying additional land when it became available and diversifying into hay production and custom grazing for other ranchers. We built a new barn and renovated the old house, always keeping Ruth's memory alive while making the place our own. Frank retired gradually, training Brian and me to handle more and more of the day-to-day operations until he was working only part-time as a consultant and friend rather than a full-time foreman. He moved into the foreman's cottage permanently, becoming the grandfather I'd never had and the keeper of ranch history and wisdom. Our first child was born in the spring, a daughter we named Helen after my mother. Watching her take her first steps in the same kitchen where my mother had learned to walk felt like closing a circle that had been broken for too long. The second child, a son we named Frank after our mentor and friend, arrived 2 years later. Both children grew up the way their grandmother had, riding horses before they could properly walk, helping with chores as soon as they were old enough to be useful, learning the rhythms of ranch life as naturally as breathing. Now, 5 years after that first terrifying bus ride to Cedar Falls, I stand on the same front porch where I first saw the ranch and marvel at how much has changed. The scared teenager who inherited 700 acres of uncertainty has become a confident woman who owns over 1,000 acres of possibility. The cattle in the pasture include descendants of the original herd Ruth built, their genetics improved through careful breeding, but their essential character unchanged. The house holds the laughter of children and the comfortable silences of a marriage built on shared work and mutual respect. But the most important change is the hardest to quantify. I've learned what it means to belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than myself, to build a legacy worth passing on to the next generation. The land that chose me has shaped me into someone I never imagined I could become. The frightened girl who owned nothing but a duffel bag of secondhand clothes has become a woman who owns not just land and cattle and buildings, but a place in a community, a role in a tradition, and a future that stretches as far as the mountains on the horizon. Sometimes I think about the path that brought me here, the series of chances and choices that led from a Chicago group home to a Montana ranch. If Ruth had never hired that private investigator, if Sandra Scott had placed me in a different home, if I'd been too scared to get on that bus, or too proud to accept help from Frank and Brian and the dozens of other people who welcomed me into their community. But I've learned that wondering about alternate histories is less important than embracing the reality you've been given. Ruth's gift wasn't just the land and the cattle and the buildings. It was the opportunity to discover who I could become when I stopped being defined by what I'd lost and started being shaped by what I'd found. The ranch has taught me that belonging isn't something you're born with or something that can be taken away by legal documents or family disputes. It's something you create through daily choices, through showing up and doing the work and caring about something bigger than yourself. Every morning when I walk out to check the cattle, I see the same mountains Ruth saw, the same grass my mother played in as a child, the same endless sky that has watched over this land for generations. But I also see something new, something that belongs to me and my children and the future we're building together. The scared girl who stepped off that bus 5 years ago couldn't have imagined this life. But the woman I've become can't imagine any other way to live. This is home, not because someone told me it was, but because I've made it so through sweat and tears and the kind of love that grows slowly and lasts forever. The inheritance Ruth left me was more than property. It was a second chance, a new beginning, and the foundation for a life I never knew I wanted until I was living it. She gave me roots in soil I'd never seen and a family I'd never known I had, spread across pastures and connected by shared work and common purpose. Now, as I watch my children play in the same yard where their grandmother learned to ride horses, I understand what Ruth was trying to tell me in those letters she never sent. Love isn't always about the words you say or the time you spend together. Sometimes it's about the chances you create for someone else, the doors you open, the possibilities you make available. Ruth couldn't give me back the mother I'd lost or the childhood I'd never had, but she could give me the tools to build a future worth having and the land to build it on. She could give me a place to belong and the opportunity to prove that I was worthy of belonging there. The ranch has made me who I am today, not just a rancher or a wife or a mother, but a person who understands the value of hard work and the importance of community and the deep satisfaction that comes from caring for something that will outlast your own life. This land has been in my family for 3 generations now, and if I do my job right, it will be here for 3 generations more. My children will grow up knowing where they come from and where they belong, something I never had, but something I can give them. That's the real inheritance Ruth left me. Not just 700 acres of grass and cattle, but the knowledge that home is something you can create even when you start with nothing. That family is something you can build even when you begin alone. That belonging is something you can earn even when the world has told you you don't deserve it. The sun is setting now over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that never get old no matter how many times I see them. The cattle are settling for the night, and the children are calling from the house that dinner is ready. Brian is closing the barn doors, and Frank is walking slowly back to his cottage, his day's work done. This is my life now. This is my home. This is the family I've built and the legacy I'm creating and the future I'm working toward every single day. It's not the life I planned when I was 17 and scared and alone, but it's the life I was meant to have. 5 years ago, I thought inheritance was about money and property and things you could hold in your hands. Now I know it's about so much more than that. It's about the stories that shape you and the values that guide you and the love that sustains you, even when it comes from people you've never met. Ruth's inheritance wasn't just the ranch. It was the chance to discover that I was stronger than I knew, braver than I believed, and more capable than anyone had ever told me. It was the opportunity to learn that home isn't a place you're given, but a place you create through daily choices and constant care. The scared teenager who inherited this ranch thought she was getting land and cattle and buildings. The woman I've become knows she inherited something much more valuable. She inherited the chance to belong somewhere, to matter to someone, to build something that will last long after she's gone. Every day I work this land, I'm honoring not just Ruth's memory, but my mother's dreams and my children's future. Every fence I fix and every calf I help deliver and every decision I make about the ranch is part of a conversation that spans generations, a legacy that grows stronger with each passing year. The ranch has taught me that the most important inheritances aren't written in wills or recorded in courthouses. They're passed down through stories and values and the example of how to live a life worth living. They're found in the knowledge that you belong somewhere and matter to someone and have something valuable to contribute to the world. I used to think I was unlucky, growing up without a family or a permanent home or any sense of where I belonged in the world. Now I know I was being prepared for this life this place, this opportunity to build something meaningful from nothing. The group homes and foster families weren't failures. They were training grounds, teaching me resilience and self-reliance and the ability to adapt to new situations. The years of uncertainty weren't wasted time. They were preparation for the responsibility of running a ranch and raising a family and being part of a community. Everything that happened to me before I came to this ranch was part of the journey that brought me here. The pain and the loneliness and the feeling of not belonging anywhere were necessary parts of learning to appreciate what I have now. I understand now why Ruth spent her final years searching for me. She wasn't just trying to make amends for the mistakes she'd made with my mother. She was trying to ensure that the ranch would go to someone who would value it, someone who understood what it meant to have nothing and therefore wouldn't take anything for granted. She was looking for someone who would see the ranch not as a burden or an obligation, but as an opportunity. Someone who would love it the way she had loved it, with the fierce dedication that comes from knowing how precious it is to have a place to call home. The ranch chose me, Frank always says, and I think he's right. Not in some mystical way, but in the practical sense that this place needed someone who would appreciate it fully, and I needed something worth dedicating my life to. We found each other at exactly the right time. Now, as I prepare to pass this legacy on to my own children, I understand the weight of responsibility that comes with inheritance. It's not enough to preserve what you've been given. You have to improve it, build on it, make it stronger for the next generation. My children will inherit more than land and cattle. They'll inherit the knowledge that they belong somewhere, that they come from people who worked hard and cared deeply and built something lasting. They'll inherit the confidence that comes from growing up in a place where they're valued and needed and loved unconditionally. But most importantly, they'll inherit the understanding that true wealth isn't measured in acres or dollars, but in relationships and purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work. They'll know that home is something you create, and family is something you choose, and belonging is something you earn through service to something bigger than yourself. The scared girl who stepped off that bus 5 years ago couldn't have imagined this life, but the woman I've become can't imagine living any other way. This ranch has made me who I am, and I've made it what it is, and together we've created something that will outlast both of us. That's what inheritance really means. Not just receiving something from the past, but creating something for the future. Not just being given a gift, but becoming worthy of it. Not just finding a place to belong, but making that place better because you belong there. Tonight, as I tuck my children into beds in the same house where my mother grew up, I tell them stories about the grandmother they never met, but whose love brought them this life. I tell them about the great-grandmother who made mistakes, but found a way to make amends. I tell them about the land that has been in our family for generations and will be theirs someday if they want it. But mostly I tell them that they belong here, that they're part of something bigger than themselves, that they have roots that go deep in a future that stretches far. I tell them things I never heard as a child, things that would have changed everything if I'd known them then. You are wanted, I tell them. You are loved. You have a place in this world that no one can take away from you. These are the words I needed to hear when I was their age, the words that might have saved me years of wondering if I mattered to anyone. Now I get to say them every night, and I get to mean them completely, and I get to watch my children grow up knowing they're exactly where they belong. The ranch that saved me is now saving them, giving them the security and stability and sense of purpose that I never had. They'll never know what it feels like to be unwanted or temporary or disposable. They'll never wonder if they have a place in the world because they'll grow up in that place, surrounded by people who love them and land that belongs to them. This is Ruth's real legacy, not just the ranch itself, but the family it made possible. Not just the land, but the love that grows on it. Not just the inheritance, but the inheritance of inheritance, the knowledge that some gifts keep giving long after the giver is gone. Tomorrow, I'll wake up before dawn and check the cattle and fix whatever needs fixing and plan for whatever comes next. I'll do the work that needs doing and make the decisions that need making and live the life that Ruth's gift made possible. But tonight, I'm just grateful. Grateful for the scared girl who was brave enough to get on that bus. Grateful for the dying woman who cared enough to find her. Grateful for the land that was patient enough to teach her. Grateful for the community that was generous enough to accept her. Grateful for the man who was wise enough to love her and the children who were lucky enough to be born into this life. 5 years ago, no one wanted me. Tonight, I'm surrounded by people who can't imagine life without me. 5 years ago, I had nothing. Tonight, I have everything that matters. 5 years ago, I didn't know where I belonged. Tonight, I'm home. If you're watching this and you've ever felt unwanted or alone or like you don't have a place in the world, I want you to know that your story isn't over. Sometimes the best chapters come when you least expect them. Sometimes the family you need finds you instead of the other way around. Sometimes the place you belong is waiting for you in the last place you'd think to look. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what home means to you. Share this video if it touched your heart because maybe someone else needs to hear that they're not alone, that they matter, that their story isn't over yet. The ranch that saved me is still here, still growing, still teaching me new things every day. But the most important thing it taught me is this. You don't have to know where you're going to end up exactly where you need to be. Sometimes the best inheritance is the one you never saw coming. And sometimes the family you need is the one you build yourself. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of belonging at a time. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for reminding me that even the most unexpected journeys can lead to the most beautiful destinations. And thank you for being part of this community, this family of people who believe that everyone deserves a place to belong and a chance to build something meaningful. The sun has set over the mountains, the children are asleep, and the cattle are quiet in the pasture. Another day on the ranch is ending, and another day is waiting to begin. This is my life now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. This is home.